Great. At this point, we're able to get and create events, and we're doing that with help of a database. Now, of course, if you take a look at the big picture, at the plan we had for this API, this is not all we need. Instead, we also need endpoints and the logic to get a single event by ID, or to update an event or delete an event. And of course, we don't have that yet. So therefore, these are the next things I'll work on. And I'll start by setting up another get route for getting a single event by ID. And here the special thing now is that the ID, of course, will be different depending on which event we want to fetch. So we need a so-called dynamic path parameter here. It's sometimes a 1, sometimes a 3, sometimes a 105, or something like this. And when using Gin, you can define such a dynamic placeholder in the path by using a colon and then any identifier of your choice. For example, ID or event ID, whatever you want. But here I'll go for ID. And this will now handle all incoming GET requests to paths like events 1 or events 5 and so on. So that's how we can set up such a dynamic path handler. Now, of course, we still need a request handler function though, a standard function which I'll call getEvent, because this function is about getting a single event now, not a bunch of events. As always, we'll get this Gin context value automatically, because I will now use getEvent, this new function here, as a request handler for this dynamic path endpoint here, or route as we could also call it. We call these endpoints here also routes, because we offer different routes incoming requests can take to trigger different actions. So getEvent is the next handler for the next route, and in here we'll now need to fetch a single event by ID. And for that, as a first step, we need to get the actual ID value that was encoded in the path. And we can get that value by using this context value that we get from Gin. And then there we can call the param method to get a path parameter value. Now in this case, since I named my path parameter ID, so that thing here after the colon, it is ID, like this, which I should try to extract from the incoming request. Now this will give me that parameter as a string, but I actually need it as an integer, because I'm dealing with an event ID, and here in my program, event IDs are integers. int64 integers to be precise. Therefore, we must convert this ID, which we extract from the path, and that can be done with the built-in strconf package, which is provided by Go, so which is part of the Go standard library, a package which we also used before in the course already. And there we can call parseInt to convert a string to an integer. Now for that, parseInt then also needs two extra pieces of information. It needs the base, so whether you work in the binary system, for example, or the hexadecimal system. But here it's the decimal system, so I'll use 10 as a base. And then you need to define which kind of int you want, so the bit size, and here that will be 64. And as a result, we'll get back an event ID, which we can store. Though we also can get back an error if the conversion fails, and therefore we should actually also be prepared to handle that. And indeed, if the error is not nil, I want to send back an error response. So here I'll copy that code from another route handler here and paste it in here, but the response code I want to use should be the bad request response code, because if we fail to extract and convert this ID from the incoming request path, it seems as if an incorrect value has been added to that path, a value that can't be converted to an integer. So it's an error made by the client, and that's what we indicate by using this bad request status code. And here I'll then send back an error message that is could not parse event ID. And I return so that no other code executes, because after this if statement, I want to execute the code that should be executed if everything succeeded. And that means that I want to fetch the event with that ID from the database. Now for that, we should go to event go, so to that file where we manage our event model. And in there, maybe at the bottom, though the exact position doesn't matter, I'll add a getEventById function where I expect to get the ID, which should be of type int64 as a parameter, and where we then want to send a query to the database to fetch the entry that has that ID. So for that, I'll prepare another query, another SQL statement, a select statement here, where I want to select all columns from events where, so here I add a where clause to define a condition, and my condition is that the ID here, the ID field in the database, must be equal to the ID I received here. Now to protect against SQL injection, I'll use that built-in mechanism provided by this SQL package, where I again define such a placeholder, such a question mark. And then we can execute this query with that query method from the DB package, or actually here with the query row method, which will simply give us back one single row instead of a bunch of rows through which we would have to loop, because I know that there will only be one row with that ID. So query row is simply a convenience method for cases like this, where we know that we will get back exactly one row, and I pass my query here to query row. Now we also can add more arguments to query row though, to provide values for all those placeholders we defined. So in my case, I have one placeholder, so I will just add one extra argument here. And that will be the value that will be inserted into this query in a safe way by the SQL package. In this case, it's this ID which I got as a parameter. So as a result of calling query row, we'll get back a pointer to that single row that was fetched. And we can now read that data from that row just as we did it for multiple rows with that scan method. But we don't need that loop with the next method. That's the difference now. Instead, now we can create our event here of type event and then call row scan to populate all the different fields of that struct. So here we again start with the event ID, then we continue with the event name, then with the event description, then with the event location, then the event date time, and last but not least, the event user ID. Now scan can yield an error if something goes wrong, if we did not find an entry for that ID, for example, and therefore we should of course handle that and check if that's not nil, in which case I want to return the error. And hence the return type of getEventById should be a combination of two values, either the event that was fetched or an error. And actually, of course, in Go, we always have to return both, but one of these two will always be nil. And here in this case, error will not be nil, but event will be, if we had an error. Now we actually can't use nil as a zero value for event, because the zero value for event is essentially an empty struct. But here, in order to be able to use nil, I will instead simply return a pointer to event, because the null value for a pointer is nil, so if there is no address available, because we have no event in this case, and therefore I can then return nil or the error, or in the success case, a pointer to the event that was created. And that is what we'll do after this if check here. Here I will return a pointer to the created event and nil as a value for the error. And with that, we have this getEventById function back in the getEvent function in the main.go file. We can now call that function to get the event for that ID. So here we can call models.getEventById and pass the event ID to that function here. And as a result, we'll get back an event or an error. And of course, we want to handle that error case, in which case I will send back an error response. And here, anything could have gone wrong. So I will again send back this internal server error status code. And as a message, I'll set could not fetch event. After this if check here, I then of course also want to send back a success response where we use the OK status code and where I send back that event that was fetched. And I do that with my context here. And that's now the finished getEvent request handler. If you save everything and you run your server again, you should therefore now be able to get a single event here by sending a GET request to HTTP localhost 8080 and then /events and then some valid ID. So to get such a valid ID, we can actually first send a request to get all events so that we see some ID we can use, in this case 1. And then we can go to get single event and use 1 as a value in the path here. And if we do that and we send this request, we should get back the data for this one single event. If we send a request to some invalid value, so something that can't be converted to an integer, I instead get this could not parse event ID message back. If I send a request for a valid integer ID, but for an event that does not exist in my database, I get back this could not fetch event error. So that all works the way it should, and we're now able to fetch a single event.